Bright Cutie. Every student matters.
Hello students, today we will start chapter number 3, History, and for class 8, Colonialism, Agriculture, Society and Industries. Let me start the chapter with the definition of colonization. Colonialism is a distinct form of imperialism, that means ruling by some other nation, in which a colonizing nation exerts direct controls over a colonized state. That means here if we talk about colonizing nation, it would be Britain, and the colonized was India. And what they did, this state directly controlled by military, economic and political means. The forceful widespread intrusion of a colonizing nation naturally causes an irreversible change in all dimensions of the colonized state, the lives of the people, and the social architecture. Now, it was a very big question like how European colonization occurred in India. Why did the British colonize India and how did it affect the people really living here? Now, what are the reasons? The establishment of company power, mercantilism, and trade wars, which unravel the story of a trading company becoming a political power. Struggle for tertiary wars with Indian rulers and the growth of colonial army and civilian administration, which shows how the consolidation of British power linked to the formation of colonial armies and administrative structures. Now, there was a change in the rural setup during the British rule. What was the condition of farmers before the British arrived in India? Before the British rule, the Indian farmers used to pay a portion of the produce from the land as tax, and in return, their right to hold and cultivate their piece of land remained intact. That means they were the owners of their lands. Now, due to this system, villages could produce enough food crops to fulfill the needs of the people living there. Thus, the village became self sufficient. That means they were producing all those things which were actually required for their village only. This was the change in the rural setup. Now, when the British people came here, they started few British policies, in which the first one is your agrarian system. Let's see what is that. The colonial agrarian policies introduced by British, and it was the agrarian policy. It imposed collection of revenue in cash. That means they had to pay their taxes in cash. It forced thousands of villages to cultivate cash crops. The company created two posts of Deputy Diwan, one for Bengal and one for Bihar. And for greater profits, the land revenue was now farmed out annually to the highest bidder. Now, in rural life and society, there were few themes and objectives. Colonial agrarian policies, their effect on peasants and landlord is the theme in this chapter, which will provide a broad view of changes within rural society through a focus on two contrasting regions. Growth of commercial crops shows the continuity and changes with earlier society, and peasants' revolts focus on indigo rebellions, discuss how the growth of new crops often disrupted the rhythms of peasants' life and led to revolts. The colonial agrarian policy referred to the policy Britishers made for the agricultural sector in India. The British were jealous of the agricultural activities going on in the country, so they created some plans like permanent settlement, Rayotwari settlement, commercialization of agriculture. Now, agricultural policies of British. Previously, British applied the same method of taxation as it was there in the locality of these places. Then afterwards, a different policy was adopted to decide amount to keep themselves. This policy was based on the conditions of different states of India, and the main issues of settlement were Zamindari, Rayadwari and Mahalwari system. Now, these were the land revenue systems in India introduced by British people. Rayadwari, permanent settlement, Mahalwari system. Now, let's start with permanent settlement. This is the first policy. In the year 1789, British government made an agreement with the zamindar, that means the landlords of Bengal, and that was permanent settlement. Lord Cornwallis decided that land revenue will be collected by zamindars. Those zamindars who will not give the land revenue would surrender their zamindari and new zamindar will take over place. Now, it was a big question for the zamindars also, like whether they had to collect the land revenues in time or otherwise they had to give up their places to some other zamindar. Now, the bid system. Before the British came to India, villages were self sufficient. We have already talked about it. Self sufficient means they were capable of producing all those things which could fulfill their desire or the requirements of their villages. Now, most of the items that were required by the villages were produced locally. That means they, all people were capable of producing all those things which were locally required. So each village had a panchayat also, and this is well known. Like panchayat system was also there, and the panchayat was there to overcome the village problems. That means they used to give the solutions. So the farmers had the rights over the land they cultivated, and he had to pay a small part of his produce as revenue to the state. In times of calamities like floods and droughts, the revenue was reduced or waived off completely. That means it was a privilege to the farmers as well, in case there was some natural disaster, floods, droughts, anything. So at that time they did not had to pay complete revenue, because it was usually it was reduced or sometimes it was completely waived off. Now, to escape from the problem of frequent decision of land revenue, Lord Cornwallis in 1789 established a rule. On the basis of land revenue paid, Zamindar will have the power of 10 years to buy and sell property. That means he gave them 10 years as in their power. Any failure in paying revenue by peasants gave them authority to acquire their lands, and for company rulers, land revenue was the main source of income. Now the next is your Rayotwari system. Now in this system, the main basis of tax collection was to have direct contact with the farmer. Earlier they had zamindars, right? And here they had direct contact with the farmer or the peasants. It was decided that after subtracting the expenditure of agricultural production, 50% of the leftover amount would be land revenue. It was a huge amount to pay as a tax. And in earlier days, the increase and decrease in the price of crops did not have any connection with the revenue. In Bombay and Madras Presidency provinces, it was established for 30 years. Even after direct contact, the peasants in the system, they were exploited. Now the third system is Mahalwari system. Now in Mahalwari system, it was from 1833 to 43. Again, the British rule started a new system of collecting revenue in the western. In the first one, if you remember, zamindars were there. In the second one, it was like directly, it was contact with the peasants or the farmers. Now in this system, the whole village was regarded as a mahal and settlement of collecting revenue. It means that all the families of peasants had a joint responsibility for collecting of revenues. That means one village had to pay one revenue collectively. So similar to the Rayat system, after subtracting the expenditure on agriculture and for feeding the peasant's family, 50% of the left money was collected as revenue. This system was also imposed in Punjab, Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. Here you could see it was not a fixed village, and then revenue from each village was also taken, and total revenue from that village. And here permanent settlement, Diwans, Zamindars, it was fixed, and in the year 1822. And then next is your commercialization of agriculture. Now commercialization of agriculture means a very clear, means trading. Now when you have to trade, that means you have to produce the thing, and after your own usage you can sell or purchase the things. So here also meaning of commercialization of agriculture means production of agricultural crops for sale in the market and rather than for family consumption. And for marketization of agricultural products, the surplus of production over consumption is required. Now, growth of commercial crops. In the 19th century, there was a major change in production of commercial crops. What were those commercial crops? Jute, indigo, oilseeds, tea, cotton, coffee, etc. Cultivation of these crops were profitable for the British as they were used widely, because in foreign countries also there was a lot of use of all these commercial crops, and Indian soil was found very fertile for the production of all these things. So here the farmers and the peasants were forcefully doing all the productions of these commercial crops. The British also used them in their manufacturing company, and after some time there was decline of the production of food grains and shortage of food supply. Now, the opening of national and international markets and agricultural goods of India should have served as a catalytic agent in the development of agriculture in India. But the actual results were different, and it is said that trade is indirect production and inefficient production, but paradoxically, Indian agriculture lacked responsiveness to these forces of trade and commerce, and agriculture became of the handmaiden of trade. Now, these were the consequences. Now, second consequence was absentee landlords rise commercialization give rise to absentee and ruin to old zamindars. Those who were rich would buy land in auction, and new owners never shifted to the villages because they had no sympathy with the local people. So their absence from the villages proved very harmful for the villages as well as the agriculture. Now, suspension of rural economy. The farmers produce according to the need of the village. The land revenue was nominal and Indian rulers were concentrated also, but the presence of British government, the whole structure of the village economy was suspended, which was a drawback. Now, importance of money lenders. The commercialization of agriculture led to the importance of money lenders. Obviously, when they have to sell out the production, so they have to increase it, and then they had to pay the land revenue also because the land revenue was very high. So, even in the time of calamity, they had to pay the revenue. So, it was a good time for the money lenders because people used to lend money from them, and just because of their miserable condition, anyhow they were forced to pay the taxes, so just they were forced to take money from the money lenders who exploited them. Now let's study about the tribals. The tribal society in India have different customs and rituals. They differ from those laid down by the Brahmins. The tribal societies did not have sharp social division of upper and lower caste, unlike the caste driven societies of the people in towns and villages. Normally, they live in forest areas. Those belongings to the same tribes share common types of kinship, but these did not mean that there were no social and economic difference within those tribes. Now, the livelihood of the tribals, how they earn money. Livelihood means the earning. Tribal people in different parts of India by the 19th century were involved in a variety of activities like broom cultivation or shifting cultivation, hunting animals and gathering forest produce, herding and rearing animals, and settled cultivation. Tribal groups need to depend on traders and money lenders. Traders sold their goods at high prices to the tribal people. Money lenders gave loans but collected high interest because of these tribals were pushed into debt and poverty. They were so poor they were not in condition to pay the revenues. At that time, traders and money lenders used to like take undue advantage of this group because they were very much poor and anyhow they had to pay the taxes, so they had to lend money from the traders and money lenders. So they used to take undue advantage of them. So therefore came to see money lenders and traders as their enemies. Now here you could see few pictures. Women of the Dongria Khanda tribe in Odisha wade through the river on the way to the market. And pastoralists, animal are herders. Like many tribal groups such as the pastoralists, give by herding and rearing animals. That means this was their livelihood. They used to herd the or rear the animals. So moving around seasonally with their herds of cattle or sheep. The One Gujars of Punjab Hills, the Lamdis of Andhra Pradesh, the Gagis of Kullu, and the Bakarwalis of Kashmir. These are few popular pastoralists or animal herders. Now, settled cultivation. Many tribal groups prefer to settle down instead of moving one place to another. They began to use the plow to farm the lands and gradually got rights over the lands they lived on. And in many cases, like Mundas of Chotanagpur, the land belonged to the clans, and British officials found settled tribal groups like Gonds and Santals to be more civilized. Hunt gatherers or shift cultivators and those who lived in the forest were often considered to be wild savage. Now, how did the colonial rule affect lives of the tribals? The British rule affected two groups of people in the tribal society, tribal chief and the chief, shifting cultivators. Now, the tribal chiefs lost authority among their own people because earlier what used to happen, the tribal chief used to control the whole tribe, but now after the British rule, it was changed. Let's see how. The tribal groups are considered important people because it is they who control their territories, right? And under the British rule, they lose their administrative power and were forced to follow law made by the British officials in India. Now, tribal chiefs were important people. They had some money and the right to manage their lands and people because they were the heads of the tribes. But under British rule, they lost much of their powers and were asked to discipline their tribe on behalf of the British government, which was a drawback for their powers. And this abjuration meant that the tribal chiefs lost the authority among their people and gradually also the will to fulfill their traditional functions. Now, the plight of the shift cultivators. The British wanted tribal groups to settle down and become peasant cultivators because they did not want that they should migrate from one place to another, and they want them permanently settled. So they were easy to control the administer because in case they have some policies for those people, and today they have the policy, and after few days they migrate from one place to another, so British people were confused that how to administer these people. So they wanted them to settle down at a permanent place. And the British also wanted a regular revenue source also. Obviously, it was not for the time being that for some time they are going to take the revenue and after some time it will be over. So they wanted a regular revenue source for the state. So they introduced in settlements, that is, they measured the land, defined the rights of each individual to that land and fixed the land the farmer had to pay the state. And the British effort to settle Jhum cultivators was not very successful. The Jhum cultivators who took to plough cultivation often suffered, and because their fields did not produce good yields, at last the British had to allow them the right to carry on shifting cultivation. Now, tribals such as Shors, Kols, Bhils, Santals, Orons, Hos, Hays, Manipuris, and Garos organized a rising against oppression by the English East India Company and the British administration. Now, as earlier also I told you, who are tribes, a group of people of the same race and with the same customs, language, religion, living in a particular area and often led by a chief. Now, numerous uprisings of tribals have taken place in the beginning of one in Bihar in 1772 and followed by many revolts in Andhra Pradesh, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Mizoram, and Nagaland. Now, the important tribes involved in revolt in the 19th century were Myzos in 1810, Kauls in 1795 and 1831, Mundas in 1889, Daflas 1875, Khasi and Gado 1829, Kacharis 1839, Santals 1853, Maurya Gons 1886, Nagas 1844 and 79, Buyas 1868, and Kondas 1870. Now, if we talk about the nature of revolt, tribal's community consciousness is strong. And tribal movements were not only agrarian but also forest based, because it was not only based on the land, it was forest based because forest was their home. Some revolts were ethnic in nature, as these were directed against zamindars, moneylenders, and petty government officials who were not only their exploiters but aliens too. Now, you all know what was happening. They were forced to pay the revenue taxes and they were very poor. They didn't have any kind of livelihood except the cultivation or the animal rearing. So, they were forced to lend money from the money lenders or the zamindars, and the government officials, they used to exploit them. Now, what we could say the reasons for the revolt: when tribals were unable to pay their loan or the interest thereon, money lenders and landlords usurped their lands, and the tribals thus became tenants on their own land and sometimes even bonded labor. So, it was a very big drawback of this policy. So, the police and the revenue officers never helped them, and on the contrary, they also used the tribals for personal and government work without any payment. Now, the courts were not only ignorant of the tribal agrarian system, now the tribes were ignored by the judiciary, because you know what was happening? Judiciary was ignoring these tribal systems, but also were unaware of the plight of the tribals. And all these factors of land alienation, usurpation, forced labor, minimum wages, and land grabbing compelled many tribes like Munda, Santals, Kols, Bhils, Worli, etc. And in many regions like Assam, Orissa, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, and Maharashtra to revolt. Now they all were against the British rule because they were the sufferers. Now the management of forest also led some tribes to revolt, as forest in some regions are the main sources of their livelihood. And the British government had introduced certain legislation. They permitted merchants and contractors to cut the forest. Now it was a big issue for the people of forest, that means the tribes, that now their forest was cutting, and it was the permission for the merchants and the contractors. And these rules not only deprived the tribals of several forest products but also made them victims of harassment also. Like they were harassed by the forest official. And this led tribes in Andhra Pradesh and some other areas to launch movement. Now there were forest law and their impacts also. The British extended their overall forest and declared the forest as the state property, which was a drawback for the tribal people. Why it was a drawback? Because British declared it as their own property. So they were tenants, or we could say like they were the borrowers of that land, which was once theirs. So some forests were classified as reserve forest and which were used to produce timber, which the British wanted. The colonial officials allowed some land for June cultivation and they would provide labor for the forest department for looking after the forest. Now, impacts. Many tribal groups reacted against the colonial forest law, like they were against British people, so they just reacted and they disobeyed. That means they did not followed. The new rules continued with the practices that were declared illegal. And such was the revolt of Sangram Sangam of 1906 in Assam. Many people, for example, like moneylenders, traders were purchasing raw goods, lending money. These traders made huge profits, but only a meager amount of reached the producers. The condition of people who went to towns for work was not better. Now the tribals were paid low wages and prevent them from returning home. Throughout 19th and 20th century, tribals rebelled against the forest law. That means they were revolting. The Kolas rebelled in 1831 and 32. Santal Rose revolt in 85. Bastar rebellion 1910 and Worli in 1940 in Maharashtra. After independence, the tribal movements may be classified into three groups. Movements due to exploitation by outsiders, like those Santals and Mundas, and movements due to economic deprivation, like those of Gonds in Madhya Pradesh and Mahars in Andhra Pradesh, and movements due to separatist tendencies, like those of Nagas and Mizos. The tribal movements may also be classified on the basis of their orientation in four types. Movement seeking political autonomy like Nagas, Mizos, Jharkhand, agrarian movement, forest-based movements, and socio-religious or social cultural movements like Bhagat movement among Bhils of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh movement among tribals of South Gujarat or Raghunath Murmu's movement among the Santals. These movements were done by the tribal people just because of the British rule. Now these are the different tribal revolts which are very famous also. Chor revolt, Kol revolt, Santal revolt, Kont revolt, Manipuri Khasi and Gero uprisings in the northeast after 1826, Sannyasi, Rampa revolt, Birsa Munda revolt. Now let's start Santal revolt which was between 1855 to 56. Now, if we talk about this revolt, Santals were a hard-working, peace-loving and simple folk, living mainly off agriculture in the dense forests of Bakura, Midnapur, Birambur, Manmam, Chotanagpur and Palmau. The permanent settlement brought these lands under company's revenue control. The Santals fled oppressive zamindars and company staff and settled down in the hill tract of Rajmahal and clearing in Murshidabad forest. They started farming here as well called a Dominico, but here too their oppressors followed them and exploitation started in full swing. Like that means they were exploited. Local money lenders cheated them with high interest rates of 50 to 500%. This was exploitation. Like they were paying a high amount of interest rates. The simple-minded Santals reeled under loans and often had to lose everything, even themselves, if loans were not paid back. Shopkeepers gave them short weight. That means whenever they used to get something, it was short weighted. British soldiers and employees forcibly took away their livestock, even the women were not spared. Now, two brothers, Sindhu and Kanu, they rose against these dreadful activities, and on 30th June 1855, 10,000 Santals assembled at the Maghnidi fields and pledged to establish a free Santal state. And common people like blacksmiths, potters, carpenters, and weavers supported them. And what was the date? 30th June 1855. And how many Santals? 10,000 Santals. And other leaders were brothers Chand and Bhairav, Bir Singh and Pramanik, and two brothers Sidhu and Kanu. And they rose this revolt. The rebels' ranks swelled and they numbered nearly 50,000. Now, postal and rail services were thoroughly disrupted. The rebel targeted railway stations, post office, police stations, European bungalows, and zamindars' house. So these were the places rebuilt, taken off. And they bravely fought with only bows and arrows with the armed British soldiers and nearly got British rule down from Bhagalpur to Mumbai. Trouble spread to Birbhum and Murshidabad as well. Several British armies were dispatched to quell the rebellion. The result of this revolt was, at last, in February 1856, the uprising was suppressed and 23,000 rebels slaughtered. And Sidhu, Kanu, and other leaders were hanged, prisoners got jail term to 7 to 14 years, and 36 Santal villages were destroyed. The revolt was essentially a peasant revolt. People from all professions and communities such as potters, blacksmiths, weavers, leather workers, and dogs joined in. It was distinctly anti-British in nature. Next revolt is Birsa Munda Uprising 1895 to 1900. Now, if we talk about Birsa Munding Uprising, in 1895, Birsa tribe urged his followers to recover the past glory. It was a tribe, and in 1895, it urged its followers. And he talked of a golden past for Mundas led to good life, constructed embankments, tapped natural springs. As the moment spread, the British officials decided to act. They arrested Birsa in 1895, convicted him on charges of rioting, and jailed him for 2 years. When Birsa was released in 1897, he was released in 1897, he began to gather support against the British by using traditional methods. They attacked police stations and churches and raided the property of moneylenders and zamindars. They raised the white flag as a symbol of Birsa Raj. In 1900, Birsa Munda died of cholera and the movement faded out. Now, what is the significance of this moment? It showed that the tribals could protest against injustice and express their dissatisfaction over the colonial rule. And it introduced laws so that the government could not take away the land from the tribals.